Be yourself positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismael, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In today's episode, I have the great opportunity to talk to Matt Stoller. Matt is the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. He is also the author of the book Goliath, The 100-Year War Between Monopoly, Power and Democracy, which Business Insider called one of the year's best books on how to rethink capitalism and improve the economy. In this episode, we talk about why monopolies and the consolidation of power are a root cause to fight. You will learn about Wright Patman, and we discuss how monopolists got enabled to misuse their power. We talk about mergers and acquisition and the inception of private equity. We talk about the early days at Wall Street, and you will learn why companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon became so powerful. You will also hear what makes Matt hopeful in regard to fighting back against monopolistic power, and we talk about decentralization. And with that, Matt, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
I'm good. So how do I feel? That's such a open-ended question. I'm a little confused. I'm a little thirsty, but I don't want to drink more. These are, I have a lot of feelings. I'm good. Things are good. I'm focused on airline regulation, rules around a restriction that we have in the US called the non-compete agreement, which says that workers can't, it's a contractual provision that says that a worker is not allowed to leave and work for a rival. It was just a rule to ban that. That was put out by the Federal Trade Commission. And so I'm looking at that. I'm thinking about the Microsoft Activision deal and whether the EU is going to bring a statement of objections. There's a lot of really interesting things going on about political economy in general, and this sort of a changing philosophy of how we understand how we understand public governance. So a lot of things are on my mind. I'm not actually thirsty.
Wonderful, Matt. Thank you very much for sharing that. And you are, in fact, the author of the book Goliath, The 100-Year War Between Monopoly, Power and Democracy. And I must say that this is one of the most profound books I have read recently, and certainly one of the books that I have taken most notes. And I want to jump right into it, and I want to start with a quote, and I'm going to cue a question. And it reads, "We attack or praise capitalism or socialism or the free market. All of this misses the point. The fight has always been about whether monopolists run our world or whether we, the people, do. That is the fight hidden from us by the revolution of the 1970s. So, Matt, why are monopolies the biggest threat we have in our economic system?"
Yeah, so if you want to, people look at inequality or as kind of on the left, people look at inequality and they say, oh my gosh, there's so much inequality. Look at so-and-so has worth $100 billion and there's a lot of people in poverty. And you can see that between, rich countries and the global south, there's like lots of ways to understand that problem. You can also look at, corruption and say, oh, there's all this corporate influence over how our governments work. And you can look at it the other way as well. Conservatives would say, oh, there's this collusion with government controlling corporations. But all of that is a description of the consequences of what's happened. It's like you're describing the symptoms of the disease, not the disease itself. And the disease itself is the consolidation of private power in the hands of the few, right? So the reason that someone is worth $100 billion, say, is because they have a chokehold over a vital trade or service, and then they can charge effectively a private tax. They own an important toll booth over a vital part of the economy. So you could look at like someone like Bill Gates. Microsoft controlled access to the personal computer through Microsoft Windows. Google controls access to the internet, right, when you're searching, and so on and so forth, right? You can look at any industry, and if there's a tremendous inequality, it's because there is one entity that's controlling the terms and the pricing in labor conditions. And if you want to address that, the obvious way to deal, so if you want to address it on the back end and say we need to deal with inequality, you might say, oh, tax and redistribute, or various other mechanisms to do something along those lines. But if you want to address the heart of the disease, what you will say is, let's not just have one, let's have two or three or four. Let's break their power. And if you can't do that because it's something like an electric utility, when you're not going to lay multiple wires, two wires to a house doesn't make any sense, then you just either have public ownership or just pricing rules from the government that says you're not going to be able to exploit this monopoly infrastructure. But either way, the symptom, the disease is a consolidation of power in the hands of a few that is essentially unregulated by any democratic system. So that's where we are. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we can talk about, but that's the fundamental social, like, and this problem also caused a lot of the social concerns that I think we have. The feeling that people don't have control over their community, their political system, the really, really deep inequities between urban areas and rural areas, the general sense that there's a lot of speech that is kind of like incendiary and sort of out of control. All of these things are a function of this consolidation of power. And if you just look at the symptoms, then you'll go for things like censorship, or you'll go for things like subsidies to rural areas, or instead of what's really happening, which is there's this massive appropriation of property by monopolists. And all you really have to do is stop that. And then you'll have a much more healthier, egalitarian, well, it's not going to be a perfectly equal society, but it'll be a society where everybody has the same political rights and people can control their, have some control over their own communities, and politics will be able to function in terms of being able to craft a society, as opposed to sort of the weird, out of control sense that everyone has today.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. And when we talk about addressing the disease, and one factor I really like about your book is that you talk about monopolies and the consolidation of power over the past 100 or so years. Another question that I want to ask you is, who was Wright Patman, and why should everybody know about him?
Yeah, Wright Patman, that's a good question. So the book is about, Goliath is about, the fights over 100 years. It's not a sad story. It's a story about, it is certainly a story about why things are so screwed up today. And the reason I wrote it is because I was working in Congress during the financial crisis, and I wanted to understand why, I'm a Democrat, why my party engineered a foreclosure crisis and facilitated massive wealth redistribution upward, because that's not what most Democrats think of themselves. And we didn't do that. Like when we had similar crises like we did in the late 1920s that fostered the Great Depression, we didn't do that in the US. We did the opposite. And we broke the monopolists. That's what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in the New Deal. It's a book that's focused on the U.S. It does have some implications globally because the U.S. is sort of a very powerful country and structured a lot of what happened. But I was sort of like trying to figure out why did we do what we did under Obama? It's not really about Obama at all, but I was just trying to figure that out. That's why I wrote the book. And what I found is there is a series of fights. And one of the main characters is this guy that we don't really know about today. His name is Wright Patman, who was a congressman who was elected first in 1929, and he was in Congress until 1976. In 1975, and in 1929, he was elected, and he immediately started fighting the kind of then monopolists who were very powerful. That the Secretary of the Treasury was a guy named Andrew Mellon, who was basically a billionaire back then when $1 billion was a lot of money. Obviously, it's a lot of money today, but it's a massive amount of money in 1929. And owned, I think he was on the board of 99 banks. He was also the Treasury Secretary of the United States. So this is like a very powerful guy, or at least he had been on the board of 99 banks before he took that job. And he and Patman got into a fight over how to handle the Great Depression. And eventually Patman filed articles of impeachment, Mellon resigned. And then over the next 45 years or so, Patman went after bankers and monopolists. Those were the two things those were his two kind of main goals. And he was very successful. He also helped build the administrative state. And he was from a rural area in Texas, which is today very Republican, but he was a very partisan Democrat, very kind of left-wing guy, but a populist, not a socialist. And that tradition of populism, which in Europe, I think is considered a bad word, but is in fact not bad at all. It's just like, if you mean fascism, you should say fascism. The reason people in Europe and in the US say that populism is a bad word is because they don't like democracy and they're afraid of democracy. And so they've misconstrued populism to mean fascism, but it's not. It's just normal people saying, we don't like how bankers are running things. And that's what Patman was. And he eventually became the chair of the banking committee. And then in 1975, so in that, that period of time, like from the 30s until the 1970s, there was kind of like this period where the middle class in the US expanded dramatically. And then after World War II, that was a global phenomenon. And that was because of these anti-monopoly policies. And then a new generation of leaders, this is kind of the Bill Clinton generation, emerged. And they had a different intellectual tradition. And in 1975, they actually overthrew Patman. So they kicked him out of his banking committee chair. And these were Democrats. This was not a Democratic Republican thing. This was a fight in the Democratic Party. And it was an intellectual fight over how do you build a good society. And the Democrats who emerged in the 1970s and afterwards thought the way you build a good society is you trust technocrats and experts and billionaires. And that's what they did. And so since really the mid 70s, we've seen the emergence of the growth, massive growth of large multinationals and the domination of every one of our industries by monopolists. And I think you've seen a similar trend driven by the same ideas, in some cases, the same people all over the world. And so Patman was kind of written out of history, even though he was very important. He was written out of history because the idea that you'd have a populist who has modern views of the economy was a very impressive thinker, and not an authoritarian at all, but just very democratic. And the method of addressing inequality was to regulate Wall Street, break up Wall Street, and also break up large firms and constrain chain stores. That's a very threatening idea because it gives the public a way to actually do things that doesn't sound crazy, but sounds very normal, because it is, right? And Patman, I think some of the laws, he wrote a law that constrains chain stores in 1936, was called the Robinson-Patman Act, which says that you're not allowed to sell goods and services, or actually just goods, to large stores at better prices than to smaller stores. You're not allowed to price discriminate if that would facilitate consolidation or monopolization. And this protected local stores, and it protected the local economies all over the US. And that law, they just stopped enforcing it in the 1970s at roughly the same time that they overthrew Patman, because they thought, oh, chain stores are good, local stores are bad. And today, we're reversing the choices that we've been making since the 1970s. So the sort of Patman's philosophy is coming back. So the current chair of the Federal Trade Commission, her name is Lena Khan. She's bringing back and trying to enforce what's called the Robinson-Patman Act, which was written by Wright Patman. And this is going to have significant changes in the economy in general. But that idea that we want to constrain large firms who are engaged in anti-competitive or unfair conduct is it's coming back pretty aggressively in the United States and somewhat in Europe as well. And that's, I think, a reversion to the ideas that Patman had, and those ideas go back to, you could take it back to the 1600s if you want to.
Thank you very much for that elaboration, Matt. And we already have heard that since the 70s, quite a bit has happened. And before we jump into the present moment and maybe even the future, I want to use another quote from the book where you talk about the financial crisis in 2008. And it says, "Our leaders responded to a financial collapse caused by a concentration of wealth and power by pushing even more wealth and power into the hands of the same people that caused it. Why?" If I would ask you that question, how would you respond to it? What is the why behind?
They had bad ideas. They had a bad understanding of history, and they had bad ideas in their head. It's no more complicated than that. There's a lot of it. It was a big mystery to me for a long time. I was trying to figure out, okay, was it corruption? And I was working in Congress, so I worked with some of these people, and they weren't corrupt. They weren't bought off per se. They just thought that that they had to do what they were doing. And their view was, well, we have a banking crisis. Who better to figure out how to fix the banking system than the top bankers out there, right? The head of Goldman Sachs seems to know what he's doing. Let's ask him, right? The top economists, they seem to know what they're doing. Let's ask them. The idea that you would do things that ordinary people might think were more fair, that was sort of considered crazy, right? Like, what are you doing? They don't know anything. They're not experts. What you need is to talk to the experts, right? And so that's what they did. And the experts said, well, you have to redistribute wealth and power upwards so that we can, once we have this power, we can regulate and make sure that things go okay. And then they did that, and it was catastrophic.
Which role did mergers and acquisitions and also private equity play in that? And what are your thoughts on both of them?
Yeah, so mergers and acquisitions, the consolidation, we have to distinguish between the financial crisis and the rest of the economy. And they're related trends. It's the same trend. But so since really the late 1970s, but more the 80s, when Ronald Reagan essentially got rid of antitrust policy, he said, we're not going to enforce merger laws anymore. You saw consolidation across the economy, and in everything from retail to defense industrial base to manufacturing to banking. And that happened in a number of ways. And one of the key ways was that mergers became much easier because the government wasn't opposing mergers that facilitate monopolization. You're not allowed, the Clayton Act says you're not allowed to buy a company if that would increase substantially your market power. The government just decided we're going to stop, we're not going to enforce that law anymore. And which is crazy because you can't just choose not to enforce laws, but that's what they did. So you had all these roll-ups. You also had the change in banking policies. So banks used to be very tightly controlled in the US. What they could do was very boring. Being a banker, you didn't have to be that smart. You just had to sit in an air-conditioned office, and you had to leave by 3 o'clock and play golf, and you had a moderately pleasant life. That's what banking was. And it was usually like the dumber people went into banking. And then in the 70s, this changed, and the Reagan administration, Carter and then Reagan, got rid of the rules that constrained bankers and said that they put in place in the 1920s because the bankers had taken much of the capital of the country and engaged in aggressive speculation, which is one of the reasons why the Great Depression happened. They just destroyed the banking system. This was global, like the European banks were also run really badly. But the idea of gambling with other people's money, that was the basic idea, was like, let's not allow that to happen. And in the 1970s and 80s, they were like, well, we got to trust the experts. The bankers, they seem to know what they're doing. And besides, the New Deal framework had kind of been shaky. There was a lot of inflation. It clearly wasn't working. But rather than adjusting that framework, they said, well, we should listen to the bankers. They want to gamble with other people's money. Let's let them do that. And so there were a series of laws that allowed them to do that. And one of the things that happened was the rise of this new kind of finance, which was called, at the time, leveraged buyouts, but it was basically borrowing a lot of money, buying companies, and then essentially looting them in various ways. That became the industry we call private equity. And because leveraged buyouts or corporate raiders had a bad brand in the 1980s, and so they rebranded in the 90s and said private equity. And over the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, Congress changed the laws to make it easier to raise money to do these kinds of speculative and generally unproductive endeavors. And it's not that it's all bad. There are a bunch of private equity firms, generally who are smaller, that make good investments. But the big guys, because it really doesn't scale, the big guys are just borrowing money and, they're just really gambling with other people's money and doing, finding tax loopholes and various other, laying people off, doing things that just kind of like a big cash grab. And so those, private equity helps consolidation because they often are consolidators. They'll just buy a bunch of companies in an industry. Like they'll go in and they'll say, we want to buy veterinarian clinics, and they'll buy 1,000 different independent veterinarian clinics, or, whatever it is, that's what they'll do. And then the big corporations will be the ones who are buying their rivals or buying their suppliers or buying their customers. So you saw kind of like two different but related waves of consolidation, and then they copy each other. Like the corporate guys are like, I want to do private equity type stuff, and the private equity guys are like, oh, this company's breaking itself up, I can buy some of the pieces of that. And then in finance, you also saw at the same time, as there was all of this merger M&A and the banks were buying each other for some of the same reasons, you also saw the removal of these rules about that prevented speculation, like Glass-Steagall rules that prevented trading of derivatives, things like that. And so at the same time as you saw, like, banks started to merge with insurance companies and started to, investment in commercial banks merged, they became really big. And then they became they borrowed a lot of money and they were doing a lot of speculation. And that caused the sort of too big to fail problem. John Maynard Keynes, who's a British economist, had a great line where he said that, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't totally remember it, but he basically said, speculation is fine as long as it's not very important. But when the economy becomes the outcome of the machinations of a casino, the outcome is likely to be bad. And that's what essentially happened in the mid 2000s and late 2000s, is that the US economy and the global economy, because the Europeans were heavily involved in this as well, became about how can we engage in more speculation. And obviously the outcomes of that were really bad, but also the response to that was not to arrest the trends. Like, they didn't go to the disease, they just tried to patch up the symptoms, as I was saying earlier.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. And I would like to shift gears a little bit and come to somewhat the present moment. And I'm going to use another quote of yours. And it reads, Google and Facebook in 2018 took roughly 60% of all online ad revenue in America. And online ad revenue is the largest and fastest growing source of advertising money. Google has about 90% of the search ad market, can track users across 80% of websites, and its ad subsidiary AdMob has 83% of the market for Android apps and 78% of iOS apps. Facebook has 77% of mobile social networking trafficking, and roughly 2/3 of Americans get news on social media. What are your thoughts on those three particular companies, Amazon, Google, and Facebook?
Well, Amazon, Google, and Facebook, if you look at when they were founded, it was the mid to late 1990s. And so they were founded after there was this substantial change over political economy rules. So in the 1980s and 90s, you saw a huge consolidation, but it was largely firms that had been created before the 1980s under the premise that monopolization was illegal. Then you had this political economy revolution in the 80s and 90s. You layer on top of that a second revolution, which is the digital revolution, the convergence of computing and telecommunications, and the birth of these companies that are born native to a policy regime that encourages monopolization. That's what Google, Facebook, and Amazon are. They were born with the idea that they were going to monopolize, and that's what they did. So they bought up rivals in whatever markets they were in. They also leveraged their power from one market into another market to try to monopolize that market as well. And they sometimes engaged in collusive deals with one another to divide up markets. But they were also involved in the core guts of a democracy, which is the flow of information in a free society. So for Amazon, it was books. Google, it's search. Facebook, it's communication with friends and family. And those are the streams of commerce that they monopolize, not just in the US, but globally. And that is something that we have never seen. It is completely against the American tradition, which has always been about decentralizing the power of media and communications. And these guys not only consolidated power over communications and advertising, which is control over newspapers and news, right? But they did it in such an extreme way that they consolidated power globally, not in China, but everywhere else. And that is really unprecedented. So that's what I think about those companies.
Thank you very much. And I have three more questions, one of which, again, includes one quote, and I'm going to read it. It's somewhat from the end of the book. "I'm not going to lie, we are in a bad spot. It isn't just that we have to contend with plutocrats. It's that we have divorced property ownership from caretaking itself. Our industrial supply chains are fragile, concentrated, and full of dangerous and hidden risks. The Chinese Communist Party, with its highly sophisticated and vast industrial power, has integrated surveillance into a nascent totalitarian model, with not only concentration camps full of ethnic minorities, but immense leverage over Western corporations. Democracies are failing globally, in part because people understand that the formal mechanisms of voting do not matter when decisions about political economy are reserved to a coddled elite. But we can fight back." You published your book on the 15th of October 2019. What has changed since then, for the better or the worse, and how do we fight back?
Well, I think a lot of things have changed. But first of all, I think it was pretty, that was, I guess, a year before the pandemic, or was it maybe not a year, just a few months before the pandemic. So that looks pretty good. I mean, I was, the supply chain saying, hey, we have fragile supply chains. Turns out we do. And I was actually early on when the pandemic started, I was like, oh, this is going to be really bad, because I knew I'd been following the supply chain. So I think the book holds up. There's a lot of books that were written, before the pandemic that don't hold up, but this book actually does. And like, if you look about what did I talk about? I talked about supply chains. I talked about monopolization. I talked about China. What are the big problems people are talking about today? Supply chains, monopolization, China, right? And what has changed, I think, is that the world has kind of caught up to these arguments. And a lot of the sort of some of the people who I wrote about in the book who were bringing back these traditions are now in positions of authority. So, Lena Khan is she got her start as a scholar about over looking at Amazon. She published a high profile piece in 2017 in the Yale Law Review. She's now the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and they're investigating Amazon. And I think that what you find is that a lot of the people who were focused on the PRC are now in positions of authority in the national security establishment. The military is much more interested in the defense industrial base and consolidation than they used to be. They blocked the merger. I think it was Lockheed Aerojet, which has to do with rocket engines. But it was a signal like, you guys need to stop consolidating. So I think there's been like a broad recognition that these are very serious problems and policymakers need to take them seriously. You're seeing a lot more merger challenges from the Department of Justice and the FTC. That's the other person who Biden appointed to the FTC, to the DOJ, is Jonathan Cantor, who's an aggressive antitrust attorney, and they are filing a lot of merger challenges. And then Joe Biden himself came out with an executive order saying that the whole government has to do what they can. Every agency has to do what they can to foster competition. And it's a good executive order. They need to do more, but like that would be unthinkable. And he actually, in his speech, he talked about the people who came up with the ideas in the 70s. One of them was a conservative named Robert Bork. And Biden actually attacked Robert Bork in his speech, right? Which is really amazing to have the president of the United States criticizing an antitrust attorney and scholar and judge from 30, 40 years ago, saying that's the wrong philosophy. So the government is kind of like starting to turn, slowly and say, okay, we need to really have public governance again. I think in Europe is a somewhat similar change, although I would say that there's like a lot more PR than there is actually substantive change going on in Europe. And the intellectual environment in Europe is probably more constrained. But I think that globally there's just this recognition that we need public governance again. We need sovereign states to run things. This idea of like a globalized utopian set of traders who will run everything without having to govern doesn't work. And it delivers authoritarianism. And I think that people kind of get that. And now we're trying to figure out, all right, what are the tools that we need to develop or use to have public governance again? I don't think we've figured those out yet, but we're starting to.
You somewhat answered the second last questions already, but is there anything else that comes to mind? If I ask you, what makes you hopeful that we can limit on a global scale monopolies going forward?
Well, I think you just see a lot of policymaking, like policymakers are acting. And, Wall Street doesn't want to admit it, but they are worried about all the merger challenges. If you look at revenues from the big banks in the US, their investment banking revenues are collapsing and they're cutting bonuses and laying people off because they just don't have as much merger advisory business. And then, so the policymakers are acting. They're also doing things like resurrecting other forms of antitrust laws, which are a little bit, take a little bit more time. But yeah, I mean, you're seeing this complete revolution in the policy world. It takes time to see the impacts, but it's happening. So that's what makes me hopeful.
Wonderful, Matt. Thank you so much. And there is a question that I, in fact, ask each and every one of my podcast guests at the very end. And I call it the 3 truths or 3 facts. And it's a rather hypothetical one. And I would like you to imagine that you're traveling all by yourself in space, actually for quite some time. Could be a couple of weeks, months, or even years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species. And they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
3 facts, or sort of 3 things in general. I mean, well, I I guess I would tell them about the concepts of love, hate, and truth.
Love, hate, and truth. Do you want to elaborate a little bit what those three mean to you?
I guess love is deep concern for others that supersedes your concern for yourself. Hate is a emotional and moral rejection of another. And these are baked into who we are. These impulses, we love, we hate, it's just who we are. And then truth is our attempt, imperfect as always, but an attempt to figure out what is. And that is what we do. We try to figure out what is. That's who we are. We love, we hate, we try to figure out what is.
Wonderful. Ma, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation. And if there is any final message or last words for today's podcast episodes, it's all yours.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that the most important lesson that we have to learn is that if we're living in democracy, we have the honor of having power. Maybe not a lot, but some. And I think the biggest myth that we learned since the 1970s is that we don't have power, that everything's inevitable. And you can't fight capitalism, or you can't fight trade and globalization. These are all things that just happen to us. These are forces. That's not true. When you look into what we do as human beings, there are just choices about how we want to build our societies. And sure, there are physical constraints, and those are real. But there are no laws of economics. They're just political choices that are baked into policy that we can make. And so we have to recognize that we have power, and that it's a scary thing to have power as a citizen, because it means you have responsibility, and you're going to get things wrong, and people are going to suffer when you get things wrong, and you're going to look stupid sometimes. But if you don't wield your own power, and then other people will in your place. So you should do that to build a good society. That's what I would say.
With power comes responsibility, but being aware that we do, in fact, have that power living in democratic systems. Matt, thank you so much.
Talk to you later. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ismaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy. Be yourself positive. Change. Just another mindset.